be discussing the essay. A lot of people cringe when they hear the word essay in a classroom. This is the form of writing that you're going to be doing most often while you're here at ECPI. When somebody asks you to write a paper, for the most part, they want you to do it in the form of an essay. Now, although you might think of an essay as hard, difficult, how am I going to do that? Once you really learn what it is and how it's structured, you're going to realize that it's much more natural than you ever thought possible. When you think of an essay, the words you really want to come to your mind is the word conversation. We have conversations every day. An essay is no more than a conversation between you as the writer and the audience as the reader. So between you and the person reading, it's a conversation. The only difference between this conversation of an essay and of an oral conversation is that you aren't there to answer any questions. So therefore, if there is a hard part, the hard part might be you have to anticipate the questions and you have to answer them before your audience has a chance to ask them. So this conversation, essays are the forms of writing that are used in most academic circles and in most cultures. We in Western culture, Europe and America, which, we are firmly, grounded pretty much in Western culture, our essays tend to follow more of a linear line. All cultures aren't the same though. So let's talk a little bit about this. If you look back here on the board in Western culture, you'll see the line. It's very linear. Now, our essay or our conversation comes from a long history of how the culture developed and evolved. Logic, reason, here's one thing, which, this is the first step, second step, third step. Very logical, very reasonable, very linear linear on that line as far as time, for the most part chronological, not, beating around the bush, as it were, but very specific. So, that's their essay. And in our linear essay, as we'll talk about in a little while, we tend to get to the point very quickly in an essay. We stay on the point, and then we repeat that point again at the end without any, ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, the Eastern essay is very cyclical or circular, as you can see, a circle or a spiral. Now, where we get to the point very quickly, on this line, and we stay on that same point, and we don't veer from it in an Eastern essay, they might talk around the point for the whole essay, allowing the reader to get a sense of where that point is, somewhere in the middle. Or they might, as in the spiral form, slowly move the reader towards the point, which is the thesis, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. But they get the momentum building in their audience so that they can come to the thesis themselves, so that reader can come to that thesis or agree with that thesis his or herself. So that's what an Eastern essay might look like. Now, in a Middle Eastern essay, you see this line going here and then here and then here and then here and here and here. Now that might look crazy, like free association. What do I think? What do I do? What do I do? But if you think about that, the way in the Middle East they would write an essay is much like we all write first of all naturally. When you sit down and you're writing something, you're thinking about, your topic might be to write about capital punishment or something like that. So you're writing about capital punishment, but then your stomach growls and you're hungry. So, you start thinking about Burger King, and so you free write, you start writing about Burger King, and then you start thinking about, how much money do I have in my pocket? And you think, I have to work tonight. And you're like, I have to get off to go, take my mother or my boyfriend or my girlfriend somewhere. I need to get, the oil changed in the car. And you're going back and forth to all of these things, which, in our Western culture, we take all of that stuff in our free writing and we beat it and we bang it and stretch it out until it fits nice and neatly on this line and in the structure that we'll talk about in a moment. Whereas in Middle Eastern culture, they think it's important to see how the writer came to the conclusions. If you drew a conclusion that came from you first thinking about Burger King, then your job and money, then your car, and then who you had to take, they want to see the progression and the journey that you went through on that. So this is what a Middle Eastern essay looks like. Okay, so Western, very linear, Eastern, very cyclical, circular, and Middle Eastern, kind of free association. Now, all these essays come, again, from the history and the culture in which these essays grew out of. But we need to focus on our essay, the Western essay, very linear. In our essay, as I said, it's a very natural type of conversation. Every essay has three main sections, and you all know what these are. What are they? Yes, an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Virtually every conversation you ever have has an introduction, a body, and conclusion. Anything you write, introduction, body, conclusion, a letter, anything. But you think about any conversation that you have. You don't just go up and start going right into whatever it is, you don't just go up and say goodbye. You usually set up something. You give some background. You at least say hello, which is a type of introduction, and goodbye, which is a type of conclusion. As we mentioned in our lecture earlier on introductions, if you were telling somebody a joke, you don't tell them the punchline before you set it up. You have to bring them in. And remember our introductions, how they started, why, general, and got more specific. As you see in the structure of our essay here, we have our introduction, as we said, our body, and our conclusion. Notice that the conclusion is the exact opposite shape as the introduction. So where we start generally and open up all those folders that we discussed in our earlier lecture to get to our thesis statement in the intro, we close them back up when we get to the conclusion. We'll talk about conclusions a little later, but let's just look at the structure of this essay. And for the purposes of our discussion and your first assignment, you're going to be writing a narrative essay. And when you hear the word narrative, you automatically think of story. The thing that makes a narrative essay differently from just a narrative or a story is the thesis statement. Remember, we said the thesis statement is the most specific sentence in the paper, probably the most important. That's really what makes this essay different from any other, maybe any other conversation, is that a thesis gives that paper one main reason for existing. You're trying to tell your reader one thing. You're trying to prove one thing. You're trying to show the reader one thing. And the thesis statement gives them that direction, or him or her that direction. So, our introduction, our thesis for that direction, our body, and our conclusion. But if you're going to tell a story, how do you do it in an essay with one main goal or one main reason? Now, we're going to discuss a specific type of narrative essay that we will use, and that is what we'll call the change structure or the change essay. And this is basically where you describe something in your life that has changed you in some way. And the reason we do this is because we're going to be using our lives, which are close to us, and we don't have to do research on to learn the essay structure. But when we progress in the other classes, this structure can be used for all kinds of other things, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, to explain change generally to any audience, there are three things that you have to know to see that something has changed you. And first of all, what it is, the event that changed you, right? But to know that an event changed you, somebody has to know how you were before the event. What were you like before the event? As we said, the event itself, and then the change. What is the result? And if you really think about it, to understand change, you have to know before what the event is and the result. Very chronological, which, as you can see, a narrative could follow this very easily. Now, how this might play out in an essay, you might talk about an accident that you were in made you afraid to drive. So, before the accident, I wasn't afraid to drive. Here's the accident and the event. Now, as a result of the accident, I am afraid to drive. Now, that might be simply what you put in an outline, which we will talk about outlines in a further lecture. So, before, not afraid to drive, event, accident, result, now I'm afraid to drive. Your thesis statement for something like this would be the event plus the result. If not for that horrible car accident I had on my birthday in 1999, I would still love to drive today. So you told them what the result is and the event. Okay, now how this might help you in other classes down the road is you can use this structure to discuss any change in any discipline. You might talk about how, wireless networking revolutionized communication. Here's before wireless networking. Here's what wireless networking is, the actual technology. Here's the result, how it revolutionized it. You might talk about how Einstein's theory of relativity changed the face of physics. Here's what people looked at or thought about before Einstein's theory of relativity. Here is how Einstein's theory of relativity described, and the result, here is how physics has changed. Now, we are looking at basic 5-paragraph essay form here. The beauty of this structure is it could be a 500-page book or a 5-paragraph essay. These don't have to be paragraphs, they can be sections or chapters. So this will help you in virtually any class that you go to. So let's review for one moment here. We write these very linear Western essays that are it's a conversation between you and a reader where you have to anticipate what they might ask. We write our introduction as we talked about before. In this narrative type of essay, our thesis statement would be something, if not for that horrible accident, I would not be afraid to drive today. The before section, I love to drive, I was not afraid to drive. The event, describe the actual accident itself, and the result, Now, as a result, I am afraid to drive. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about types of outlines that you can use to actually put this essay form into an outline. We're going to do very simple outlines, kind of just like what we have here, and go to very complex outlines that basically, once you do this outline in the pre-writing stage of the process, all you really do is fill in the blanks to write your rough draft. So, I'll see you next time when we talk about outlines.